For the torso foundation, you're going to need the front and back bodice slopers. The front bodice sloper with waistline dart, back bodice sloper with shoulder and waistline dart. You will also need a set of measurements. Make sure you write these measurements down somewhere on a piece of paper. The hip depth, front hip depth, back hip depth, the front hip arc, and the back hip arc. So we'll call those, you're going to need these 4 measurements. Go to the front of your textbook, find those measurements, write them down. You want to find size 8 measurements. Write down the full scale measurements for these. We'll deal with dividing them in half as we work through this, but work with the full scale measurements to begin with. Trace the front bodice sloper. I'm going to establish my grain line and cross grain so I can properly align this to my paper. Align this to the grain and cross grain and trace. Note I'm marking the corner down here for my cross grain. Either will work. Either this line or that line. Be sure to copy all of your notches, copy all the internal points. Okay, I'm going to redraw my dart. I'm going to cut this out. I'm not cutting exactly on the line. I still want to keep my pencil marks intact. What's most important is cutting along the center front and the waistline. I'm going to cut my dart out as well because I won't be needing this. Make sure to cut all the way to the apex. All right, front bodice sloper copied and cut. Label the side waist as X. Where the side seam meets the waistline, label that X. Draw a line from the mid-shoulder to the apex, to the bust point. We've got a notch on mid-shoulder already. I'm just going to draw a line between that and my apex. Cut to, but not through, the apex, the bust point. Leaving just a little bit of paper intact so you can easily pivot your darts, because we will be distributing some of our waistline dart into the shoulder. Set this aside, be very careful. Omit the instructions for slashing your back pattern. You do not need to trace that to another piece of paper. Just know where your X point is, where the waistline meets the side seam. I'm going to draft my torso slopers side by side on a single piece here, and then I'll cut them away later. So I'll do my front sloper here, my back sloper over here. Square a line and mark the corner A Just want to get an idea of how wide my front sloper is, just so I have enough room to work with. That should be fine. Square a line, mark the corner, A. A to B is the front hip arc plus 1/2 inch of ease. Use your full scale measurements. Get your front hip arc plus 1/2 inch. Then divide that number by 2 to get your half scale measurement. And that will be point B. So the textbook conveniently does not tell you where D it is. It is your front hip depth. So A to D is your front hip depth. Find that measurement in your textbook, divide that by 2 for half scale, and mark that as point D. So there's A, there's B, there's D, and we're going to square all of these lines off. I'm going to square across from D, square up from B, to find point C, where these two meet. Three-quarters of an inch in from C, we're going to cross mark. I'll zoom in here so you can see what's going on. There's A at the corner. B is the front hip arc plus 1/2 inch of ease divided by 2 to get half scale. A to D is our front hip depth divided by 2 to get half scale. Square out from D, square up from B to find C. 3/4 of an inch in towards this line A to D. We'll make another mark and create a point there. 1/2 of 3/4 of an inch is 3/8. There's our little point that we want to create there. Now I'm going to get the front bodice that I was working on earlier. Place the bodice on the square line so the center front touches D. And I will take that into place. So that's the first part of my bodice locked down. This is still free to move. Close the waist dart until point X touches this line, touches the line C to D. It may not touch this point, even though we created this little point here, it might not touch that point. So here is my point X, right here, touching this line. It's not all the way up here, it's not sitting all the way down here, it's right there on that line. Tape that down. And then I can tape the rest of my front bodice into place. We're not tracing anything as it says in the textbook. We're just going to go off of the draft as we have it here. I'm going to work on the back. As we did for the front, square a line. We may as well try to keep these level. So I'm just going to keep that line from A to B going over here so that they lay at the same level. Square up a line. Mark the corner A again. Just as we did for the front, A to B will be our back hip arc plus 1/2 inch of ease. Calculate that with full scale measurements, then divide it by 2. There's B over there. B to C, even though we're working on the back of the torso, B to C is our front hip depth. The reason for that is that it ensures our side seams will be the same height when we go to draft this, because our side seams need to be identical from front to back. So B to C is our front hip depth, exactly the same as what we had over here. Oh, let me square that. Make sure I'm squaring that up. There's C. Make sure it's the same. Yep. And then we can square across from C to find D yet again. So D, once again, started with A, back hip arc plus 1/2 inch, then divided by 2 for half scale. B to C, front hip depth, divided by 2 for half scale, and then square it over to find D. As we did before, from C towards D, we're going to measure our 3/4 inch divided by 2 for half scale. That's our little point that we want. I don't want to lose that point over here on the front. A to E is our back hip depth. So find that measurement in the textbook, the back hip depth, divided by 2 for half scale. It's going to be slightly lower than our front hip depth. Not quite as noticeable on half scale, about a 1/16 of an inch, but on full scale, we're looking at about an 1/8 of an inch difference. Now, we did not make a copy of our back sloper because it's a waste of time, it's a waste of paper. But remember that the side seam hitting the waistline is our point X, just like it was here on our front. So this is the same point X referred to in the textbook. Place the center back on the vertical with point X touching our line C to D. There we go. So center back should be along the vertical line, and where the waistline meets the side seam should be sitting on that line C to D. You will find that it will be taller right here. This center back meeting the waistline will not match to your C to D line. Hold this in place, pin it, weigh it down, trace it. Make sure you're tracing all internal points, all of your notches. We do not need our waistline dart, but we do need the neckline, shoulder dart, armhole, side seam. We don't need anything else going on down in here. let's get this all cleaned up. We've already established where our shoulder dart is, but we need to push this dart point off. So we will find the center of our dart. We can measure it, we can fold it, we can eyeball it. There's the center to the apex. Measure 1 inch in full scale, 1/2 inch in half scale to find our new dart point. And redraw our dart legs. Now we'll establish our side seam for our front piece, where our armhole meets our side seam to this point that we made on our line C to D. That will be that's going to cover the top portion of the bodice. We're going to just draw that directly into there. From the side where the armhole meets the side seam to this point, 3/8 of an inch for half scale, 3/8 of an inch in from C. And then we will curve our hip. Use whichever kind of hip curve you prefer. I don't like a very pronounced hip curve. Here's my hip curve going into my side seam. This is all the side seam for the torso. As you can see, it covers the bodice, goes past the waist, and goes down into the hip. We've already added that 1/2 inch of ease, 1/4 of an inch on half scale. So we've already got ease down here at the hip, so it should be large enough to fit across the body. Now we will mark our darts, because even though we can sew a torso sloper like this, it won't be very fitted. So we're going to add 2 sets of contour darts, fisheye darts, 4-point darts, whatever you want to call them. We're going to put 2 of those into here. So I'm going to drop a vertical from my apex. I'm going to use my ruler to my advantage to make sure I'm lined up straight along our center front. Straight down from the apex. We've already established where our waistline is. That's line C to D, 3 inches down. Remember, we're working in half scale, so 3 inches divided by 2. Square a guideline 1 inch down. Remember, we're working in half scale. Make sure your ruler is aligned to your center front so we can keep that square, keep that horizontal. Draw a parallel line 1 3/4 inches. Remember, we're working in half scale. So divide 1 3/4 in half to find this other parallel line. We want to make sure both of these darts end at the same level, so we're going to square this guideline out where I have this little mark down here, where I measured my 3 inches down half scale, so this is 1.5 inches. Square this across. So we've marked these out. Make sure you're checking and double checking your measurements. Make sure you're dividing them by 2 according to the measurements that are in the book. Make sure you're dividing those in half before you start scaling all these out. So they should match mine. Now I know where the top and bottom points are these 4-point darts are. I just have to find the widths of them, and that is in the textbook on that diagram. Remember, the measurements are in full scale, so I will be using half scale to mark these out. So they're adding a 1/4 inch on either side of that center line, of those center lines, excuse me. Half scale. So the textbook adds a 1/4 inch out from either of these two vertical lines. So from this vertical line, they measure a 1/4 inch this way and a 1/4 inch to the right and 1/4 inch to the left. But we're doing half scale, so half of a 1/4 on either side. That will mark out where our darts will go. I will trace this in marker. Make sure to clearly identify your dart points. These are 4-point darts, so each should have 4 points clearly marked. Remember, this is our new dart point for our shoulder. We can still keep the apex just so we know where it is. I'm just going to trace over these with some markers so it's a little easier to see. The neckline stays the same, shoulder and armhole stay the same. Side seam comes into that little mark that we made earlier. And then of course our hip curve, it curves back out along the hip. On full scale, you can also smooth out this curve ever so slightly if you find that it comes to too much of a harsh corner. You can smooth it out just a little bit. Let's go over to the back. So we don't have an apex on the back as a guideline. I forgot to trace my shoulder dart. Don't want to forget that. There we go. We don't have an apex as our guideline to make a 1-inch guideline, but we're going to place a guideline 1 inch below the armhole level. Remember, we're working in half scale. Keep your ruler aligned to the center back and draft out a guideline 1/2 of 1 inch below this armhole point where the armhole meets the side seam. Now the textbook wants us to drop a guideline 5.5 inches down from our waistline. We've already established our waistline from line C to D. 5.5 inches I think is too deep of a dart even on full scale. I prefer 4.5 inches to 5 inches. If you're going to do if you prefer a 4.5 inch long dart, a little bit shorter dart, you'll measure 2.25 inches down from our waistline, because remember we're working in half scale. If you want to do a 5 inch long dart on full scale, that would be 2.5 inches. I'm going to do 2.5 inches because I prefer a 5 inch long dart on my back waist. So 2.5 inches for me. And I will square that up to the center back line. So from center back, we're going to measure 3.25 inches along the waistline. Remember, we're working in half scale. So 3.25 inches, divide that by 2. And square that up and down from our guidelines. Make sure it's parallel to center back. And then from this line, make a parallel line 2 1/4 inches. Remember, we're working in half scale. Again, make sure that's parallel. Again, the book is indicating 1/2 inch dart intake on either side, so 1/2 inch to the right, 1/2 inch to the left of each of these guidelines. We're working in half scale though, so 1/2 of a 1/2 inch. One 1/2 inch divided by 2. And now we've marked out our 4 points. I'm going to trace these in marker so you can see them. Be sure to clearly identify your tailor's tacks, your dart points, so they're easier to see. So I know that you know that there are 4 points for each of these darts. And our side seam is drafted the same way as our front. Armhole meets the side seam to our point on our waistline that we marked. And then curve our hip to point B. When working on full scale, be sure to walk your seams. Make sure that the side seams actually do indeed match up from center, from the front and the back torso. Your hip curves should be mirror images of one another. If need be, position where you want your hip curve to be and make some marks on your curve ruler so you know where the hip level is. So you can just flip that over, match up the same mark on the opposite side, and draw the same curve. So you should have a shoulder dart on front and back. Necklines remain the same, armholes remain the same. You should have your side seams meeting at those points, 3/8 of an inch in from letter C along the waistline. Hip curves should be identical, mirror images, and you should have 2 darts properly positioned.